I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand today. I recognise their enduring connection to land, water, and community, and pay my respects to the elders of the past, present, and future. On first glance, the suburb of West End in Brisbane appears to be a hidden sanctuary of representation and inclusivity of First Nations peoples. Paradoxically, to eco kinship, West End is found nestled in amongst continual infrastructural development of country, alongside attempting to acknowledge and address social injustices faced by First Nations peoples. During the task of creating this digital story, I proudly assumed the diverse and intersectional community of West End to be an easy place to find equality and true allyship. With the suburb homing organisations dedicated to tailoring services for First Nations peoples, outwardly holding intentions to write a new narrative for the dark history of West End, I presumed better outcomes for First Nations peoples in this area. This history is encapsulated in its essence by Boundary Street, a street sign dating back to 1829 used as an exclusion zone for First Nations peoples to keep them separated from white Europeans. As West End is a largely migrant-based community, Orientalism is a familiar concept to citizens, potentially explaining the superficial appearance of First Nations people's advocacy and vain attempts to acknowledge familiar feelings of ostracisation. In using the recognition of ownership through paintings and signage, it feels like a hopeful nod at equalising historical white supremacy policies that have produced inequitable systemic outcomes driven at the core by assimilation. West End is now colloquially considered to be inhabited by politically fringe minds by other Brisbane residents, who presumably by citizenship of the area support First Nations peoples. However, by the time I arrived at week 6 in the course content, I viewed my local suburb of West End through a new critical lens. How successful have the appearing social justice priorities of this community been? Beginning by acknowledging the diversity and culture of the many nations of First Nations peoples, I now look around this growingly gentrified area with unanswered questions regarding how First Nations peoples feel about their kinship with land being marketed to the beneficiaries of the continuously profiting historical cycle of land dispossession. With connection to country being at the heart of First Nation people's identity, it is undeniable that irreversible environmental damage in the form of development has taken place. Furthermore, historical buildings of Kirraluppa land, the name given to this suburb by First Nations peoples, pose further complexities into the display of Kirraluppa titles on traditionally invasion-driven sites, now commercially constructed to benefit an economic system built for white Australia. For First Nations peoples, the south side of Brisbane was a favourably used resource zone for ironbark, stringybark, valued timbers, vegetation, and woodland animals. A place once plentiful in abundance of supply for sustainable environmental living is now plentiful only maybe in skyrisers and designer dogs. With South Brisbane being home to one of the largest First Nations people's community-driven organisations in Queensland, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Services, this organisation aims to offer assistance to First Nation peoples in the area of drug misuse and youth homelessness. Questions need to be asked as to why the figures of engagement in this service are increasing. Coping mechanisms from a structurally disadvantaged system built on white supremacist ideologies underpin the answer to current poor health outcomes and continuous impacts on First Nations peoples. West End perfectly encapsulates the current political shift from conversations of decolonisation to the hopefulness that recognition of the past will suffice, manufacturing discourse of realistic possibilities in actionable movements towards justice and further benefiting the fictitious narrative of terra nullius. Looking to the future of the local West End community, I ask what social justice for the owners of this land could look like. Whilst leadership bodies like Queensland Aboriginal and Islander Health Council exist, they are stagnant within the predetermined Eurocentric system of policy and law prescribed by dominant societal groups. How is it enough to settle for First Nation people's leadership in a system built on the genocide of a culture? The appearance of social justice in West End gives me familiar feelings of reading the Close the Gap report. This false sense of security through recognition of problems breeds apathy surrounding the underlying cause of issues, with assumptions that someone is addressing them. Who, if not me? I feel we are all under the same umbrella of hopefulness without accountability. Structural inclusion needs to be actioned within this community before First Nations people can exhibit self determination to equalise their quality of life. A socially just situation within West End would report less use of engagement in services built for coping mechanisms, a shift in paternalistic policy, and sovereignty to govern positive outcomes for First Nations peoples. Much like the Close the Gap report, West End endeavours to recognise current socio-economic disadvantage for First Nations peoples through acknowledgement, but fails to employ real positive outcomes for First Nations peoples. West End to me appears to be a classic tale of caring, as long as it's not at the cost of our own privilege.